Hello, hello. Come to the edge. We can't. We might fall. Come to the edge. We can't. It's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and she pushed, and they flew.
Today has been quite a long time in the making. You might think that it all just happens, but of course it doesn't. So it's a culmination of a whole series of focus groups that met across the country in 2011, where women from Christian and Muslim faiths came together to ask each other what are the key issues facing both Christian and Muslim women in their particular areas. So across Burnley, Bradford, Blackburn, I don't think they had to begin with a B, Bradford, Burnley, Blackburn, Leicester and London, women came together and said to themselves, what are the key issues facing us in our areas at the moment, and how can we be more empowered to create more sustainable communities? We have to get to grips with this type of work because we have to begin to break down some of the prejudices and stereotypes that are so prevalent in our society at the moment. So we keep each other at a distance because of the fear. Maybe it's the fear of saying the wrong thing, or maybe it's fear of difference. But we have to learn to be inquisitive, curious, and to celebrate the other. And I think part of that is part of what this conference is really about.
She needs to have a real hope, a real belief in humanity, in herself, in others. She needs to act in faith.
We'll just start with where you're from.
I'm Liz and I'm from Bradford.
And what have you made of the past few days? What are the types of conversations that you've been having?
I've loved the past few days. I think today, the last day, was quite different to yesterday, the first day. We did some almost practical skills in helping us engage in interfaith dialogue, tools that we might take away, whereas today seemed to have kind of a more, not necessarily global, but at least a national perspective on and perhaps challenging us as women when we're going back into our areas, what kind of roles we could be playing, some of the things we need to bear in mind. And I think it was interesting. It wasn't just encouragement, you're great, you're doing great things, but actually, you know, particularly Tina Beattie really saying, actually, is it enough to just carry on conversations with people of faith, because is that not just too comfortable? And Julie Siddiqui picked up on a similar theme. So I loved this morning. I found that fascinating. It is really important for women to come together in an interfaith context. I think if we're thinking about Bradford particularly, because if not, often women won't participate in mixed circles, so that's a barrier. But actually, aside from that, even if that was possible, I would still want to have women-only spaces. I think we come from a different place, we play different roles, and there's a lot of challenges that we're facing out there in the big wide world that we need to perhaps resource ourselves and support each other to be able to go out and take on those challenges. So I think it's really important. And also I just love it. I enjoy it in a way that is different from when I'm doing other types of interfaith work. And it isn't to say it's more important or less important, it's just different. And I think what's been great in the last 2 days is that we've been kind of encouraged that it's okay to be different and embrace those differences and stick with them when they're difficult, but the differences are really important and not to gloss over them. And I think that's a message that I'm taking home with me. I came to this 2 days with a view of getting some energy together to start some more work off with women in Bradford of different faiths and to resource myself in the interfaith work that I do. What I didn't think that I'd get that I have got is the value of meeting people from different places, and some of the best conversations I've had are with people from London, I'm from Birmingham, I'm from Middlesbrough, I'm from Burnley, and hearing about things that are going on in other places. I'm so involved in Bradford, it's hard for me to speak from an outside Bradford perspective, but actually I think one of the dangers of being in Bradford is that we think that it is the centre of the universe, which it is obviously, but that everything is unique to Bradford and we have got the worst, we've been dealt the worst hand and our challenges are so much worse than anyone else's, and that we can become kind of blinkered, and actually you need to look outside of that place and you need to be taken out of Bradford and meet with people whose challenges are as difficult but different, and how are they dealing with those things and some of the wonderful things that they come up with and the new ideas and the fresh perspectives. And then I think that that's going to enrich us going back to Bradford and being very excited about some of the things that we want to do now off the back of meeting other people. And actually we've just had conversations where we've exchanged cards and details with people from London, from Birmingham, from Middlesbrough, from Burnley. So it sounds like we'll be doing quite a bit of travelling and hearing about the work that's going on at Blackburn Cathedral as well, and the stuff that's happening there. So, you know, there's parallels to be drawn from these different places. So, yes.
Fantastic.
And we just plastered the city centre with green ribbon. We gave people green ribbons to wear around their wrists. We tied them on the trees, on the railing. And the day the EDL came, we were not physically present, but our voices, even though they were silent, were heard. And I just think perhaps we have a different way of having our voices heard.
What I was going to say, let's start with actually, what types of conversations, Anjum, have you been involved in during the course of day 1 and day 2 of the residential?
I think it was an opportunity to talk to women who came from grassroots, who were interested in their communities, who were interested in what was not going right and how they could help. And there were also, the learning curve for me was listening to women about the same problem, but how they were resolving the same problem in different towns. I try to move from monologue to dialogue. I don't do debates, so I think I facilitate people to have difficult conversations around a table in an environment that is not threatening. And we've had very interesting conversations ranging from radicalization of Muslim youths to 9/11 situation to Guantanamo Bay, and how do we have a conversation with the right-wing parties like the BNP, members of the BNP? And sometimes we have all those in a cathedral because religious organizations and religious buildings dictate their own behavior. If I was to have that conversation in a pub, chairs would be thrown. But that can't happen in a mosque or in a cathedral. So
this idea of a sacred space.
Absolutely. How can you share a sacred space? You know, what do you need to do yourself before you walk into somebody else's sacred space?
You know, there's a couple of things, kind of responses that you had on the panel, and I could sense this. There is so much that we have to deal with. What are some of the things that really kind of challenge you personally and frustrate you at times?
I am passionate about justice, not for a community, but for all humanity. So right from the early childhood, I found it very easy to deal with people at every level. I don't treat people because they're brown or they're white or they're Christian or Muslim or Jews. To me, they're human. And that's what I expect everyone to be able to do. I find that doesn't happen. When you do not have justice for all, you have problems in communities. And we become segregationist. And then our political situation doesn't help, because at a grassroots level or at a local borough council level, sometimes you find the Asian councillor doing the Asian thing and the white councillor doing the white thing, whatever that may be. I don't understand that. I'm against any of that. We have to be very honest. Our political and religious leadership is weak and very fragmented. And we don't have those structures. I mean, if you look at the Church of England, you know, you have you have a clergy system, don't you? We don't have that. So who do we go to when we seek advice? It's going to be the local mosque. Now, if the local mosque does not entertain women, well, you've closed the gates immediately. Absolutely, and that does happen. In many communities, mosques are not accessible for women. We have to be very honest. We have major umbrella organizations, which unfortunately don't meet the needs of women. So where do we go? Sometimes we go to half-baked scholars who do more damage than good. Or we switch on the TV and listen to what the scholar may be saying, which is great, because some of these mosques do wonderful jobs, but they need to enhance their work and meet the needs and contextualize. Nobody disputes what the Quran says, but you've got to contextualize that to the needs of the community today. We're not living 1500 years ago, and we're not living in Pakistan, India and Sri Lanka. We're living in the United Kingdom, and we need to resolve the situation of our home. And I think these are the difficulties that scholarship needs to really understand, and I'm so sorry to say it's not understood.
It takes me back to a conversation I once had with Jonathan Sachs, who said sometimes it's so easy to have an interfaith dialogue and it's so very difficult to have an intra.
Absolutely.
faith dialogue.
Absolutely.
And I sense it. But do you think there are those sacred spaces, and in order for us within the Muslim community to come together and have some of the difficult discussions, rather than at times people feeling that we brush certain issues that are deemed either far too controversial or personally and spiritually too challenging for us to get to grips with?
Far in between. I think what has happened is because of media technology, because of paper and visual technologies, religion and theology has become the domain of every single person. There was a time when it was the domain of a few. So there's a lot of confusion. And I think people, the scholarships, and certainly leadership needs to provide safe space for people to have those discussions, not just for the scholars, but even for people like me, ordinary human being who are interested in my faith. I want a discussion, and I want to pose challenging questions. But to be told, oh, you can't ask those questions because they are somebody else's domain, is not acceptable anymore. And that worries me, because those young people who are asking the difficult question may go to the wrong person. Internet. So I think there are spaces that are being provided for people to ask the difficult question, but they are very rare. And they are for privileged few.
One final question, and that's around the important role of women, and Tina spoke about that really well. Why is it so important? Why is it that I hear so many people talk about the fact that change lies in women? And you talked about motherhood earlier as well. Why?
Because I don't believe that women do not have a voice. I think women have a voice, and a very loud one at that too. I think they don't always have a platform. So we need to provide a platform. Why? Because the mother is the nurturing element. She nurtures future generations. Whether we like it or not, whether we work outside or at home, eventually we do come back home and we are the mother. If we are, we have children. And we bring our children up according to how we understand. So a qualified, educated mother is a mother who rears communities. And for me, that's, from a religious perspective, that's very important. You know better than I do that they say, Islam says that if you're looking for paradise, look under the feet of your mother. Not the daughter, not the sister, but a mother. And the role of motherhood is extremely important because she rears future generations. There's an old saying in the country where I was born that if the women of that country go astray, whatever that may mean, then very shortly communities are destroyed. And I believe that. So I think women need to be educated not only in their own religion, but other faiths, but also in secular education, and to know their rights. And for me, if you want to really fulfill an obligation, then teach the Muslim woman the rights in her faith, and you will have a very strong community.
I think in the question it says, why are women not heard? And I think it begs the question of who's listening. And often women are speaking and are saying things and are communicating stuff, but it's not heard in the sense that the media don't pick it up. It's not the dominant story. It's not the dominant story. Tends to be the louder voices that get heard, as if they're speaking for everybody. But women's voices often they are community based, or they are working in a different way. It doesn't make a big news story. It doesn't hit the news headlines. So it's as if we're not speaking.
So Tina, just tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're involved in to begin with at the university.
Well, I teach theology and religious studies, so I have very mixed groups of students. We always have classes where I may not know the religious backgrounds of the students I teach, but I know that there is a large mixture, including many Muslims, mostly women, but some men, Christians from different denominations, agnostics, all sorts. That's a very rich environment in which to teach theology and religious studies.
Why is it so important for women to get together and have some of the discussions that we've been having today?
Because our voices just aren't heard, and I think they're particularly not heard in interreligious dialogue. I look at all the people I know working in that field, and really it's a field dominated by men, concerned with men's interests, often concerned on doctrinal issues which I think are important, and I don't want to underestimate that. But really, for most of us, our religion matters in the fabric of our daily lives. And for women, our questions of how does our religion help us to live as mothers, in our places of work, in our relationships and marriages, those are the real questions that I think most people ask of their faith. And I think to talk together about those questions in a safe, private environment as you've created here is really important.
You mentioned a couple of things in your talk that I was interested in. You talk about the culture of violence. And in a sense, you were talking about trying to get beyond the superficial and into a realm where those deeper, more meaningful conversations about the difficulties, about the challenges, those sorts of conversations are able to take place. And you focused on 3 areas. Tell us a little bit more about that aspect of it.
Well, I'm very interested in questions of identity and alienation. You know, I think those are both things we juggle with in a very complex world where all our identities, I think, crisscross across different communities and ways of belonging and believing. I'm also interested in honestly facing up to questions of violence and conflict, and I think particularly our 2 religions, Christianity and Islam, don't have a good history around violence, and I think there's something very patronising when secular leaders try to domesticate us by telling us how peaceful our religions essentially are. I'm not persuaded that they are, and I think we've got to face up to the fact that we have too much bloodshed in our shared history, and still today as women we're quite likely to find that, you know, our sons particularly are brought up in cultures of violence that we have to address. And I think we mustn't just be kind of domesticated around that and told, you know, you must be nice, peace-loving, religious people. It's not quite that simple. And we as women, I think, particularly have a perspective that can shed light on that, because I don't think women are just perfectly innocent, peace-loving members of the human species. I mean, we share responsibility for our histories, but we usually aren't the instigators. We're usually not the leaders in these conflicts. We mop up the blood and bury the bodies, and we've done enough of that over time. And lastly, I think if we're going to ask those questions, then we have to ask what community and solidarity really mean. You know, it's not good enough having cups of tea together while in our name people are killing one another not so far away. You know, I think there are difficult, complex questions to be asked, but I think women have a particular interest and a particular wisdom to bring to those questions, largely because we've been relatively powerless in the past.
It's a 1-year anniversary of the Arab Spring, and I know that you touched on this during your talk, which was looking at the Arab Spring and the role of women. What are your feelings around what happened and what learning can take place? Because a lot of the women here have been saying there's so much that we can learn from what happened because women were key. What are your views?
I think one must always remain hopeful about such courage, and it fascinates me, you know, that while the popular Western perception of Islam is so often it's oppressive of women, it's not free, it's not democratic, you know, where has the greatest upsurge of democratic hope come from in recent history? And look at the women who were on the streets as part of that. I think the fear is, and already we see it beginning to happen, is that women are always necessary in the heat of a revolution, but once institutions and structures start to rebuild, women often then get once again pushed out and the same old politics begin to prevail. So it's very easy to sit here in safety and comfort and say, I hope they don't lose courage. But, you know, really the test of it will be the long, slow process of nation building and community building. And I think the best thing we can do is not to always be looking there, but to say, what must we do to change our structures and our worldview in the West in order for those things to bear fruit?
Talking about structures and institutions, etc., what would you say in terms of the Christian faith or Christianity in the UK? What are some of the challenges in that respect? Because so often when we look at issues, Islam has an incredible focus and an attention because of what has happened over the past decade or so. But what would you say in the UK the current challenges are for Christians living in the UK?
That's an interesting question. I mean, certainly we do live in a very aggressively secular society, but at the same time, Christianity is a very privileged religion in the society, I suppose particularly the Church of England being the established church, but Christianity does enjoy a privileged position. And I think one of the risks is a kind of domestication of Christianity. It interests me how many significant intellectual figures in British society suddenly became a little more Christian after 9/11, not because I don't think they've got any deep Christian conviction, but because they see Christian culture as somehow a defence against what they perceived Islam to be, and that's bad Christianity. Domesticated Christianity, that kind of, people need that in their lives, but I think it's always usually the quietest, most hidden gestures of people who are working in desperate situations to bring hope. And I don't think it's just Christians doing that, but that is where Christianity is to be found in this country. It's where it's always to be found.
Could be standing here and encouraging, empowering all these women to higher education. Oh, speeches. It's all so much hot air. Watch. On the contribution of my right honourable friend, the member for Sedgefield.
Julie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I live in Slough. I've been Muslim since 1995, married with 4 children, and currently working for the Islamic Society of Britain as Executive Director.
So I'm going to just go into it straight a bit. You know, you've kind of been at the receiving end of some of the comments and statements that women here are making, and there's been a lot of interesting conversations taking place. What are some of the conversations that you've been having?
I think it's always enlightening, and I think there's definitely a sort of a feeling when women come together from different backgrounds, or in this case from different faiths. It is very, very powerful, and I think what it does is it allows us to have a space where people can speak freely in a way that they maybe can't normally. And certainly a number of ladies have said to me that they feel that some of the things I said, but also some of the things they've been able to then ask and discuss in their own groups, have been very eye-opening, and actually they feel that there is a valuable space. So I think the space you've created here is crucial, actually. So some of the things I think people need to continue talking about, which have come up here, issues around media, for example, and how that is having an impact on all of us, whether we kind of like it or not. Some of the issues around women's day-to-day lives. You know, obviously Muslim women are very much in the spotlight, if you like, in terms of scrutiny and questioning, but actually a lot of the issues that we see in Muslim communities are also happening elsewhere. And this idea that, you know, a lot of our institutions and organisations are very much male dominated clearly is not just a Muslim issue, although we know obviously that's a very big thing for us. It's happening elsewhere as well, and I think hearing some of the other people speaking, and even the really insightful comments and in the workshop scenarios, just makes me realise A, that we need to carry on doing what we're doing, and B, there just needs to be more of this. There's something very powerful about bringing people together from other places, I think, and then being able to share what they're doing, but also learn from others as well. There's been a lot of that, I think, going on.
You mentioned in there this idea of the Muslim community in terms of this intra-faith dialogue that has to take place, and the need to be honest about the issues. What is it, I mean, just to kind of reassert what you were saying, what is it that you feel as a Muslim community we need to be honest about?
I think there has to be much more robust outward expressions of our feelings about certain issues. So within the Muslim sort of communities, we have this idea that we can't possibly speak about somebody else who's Muslim. This concept of ummah, you know, and I feel that needs to be challenged head on and dealt with, and say, look, if someone is doing something wrong or talking in a way which is clearly damaging or unhelpful, and we know we have a big problem with that. We have a small, loud minority who speak over what I would consider to be the large, silent majority. So, you know, most Muslims in this country living their lives, kind of getting on with things in the way that everybody does. When you have then a small minority who speak very loudly, but clearly not in our name, although they feel they are, we have to speak out about that, and amongst ourselves is fine, but also publicly as well. But it's about trying to encourage Muslims to be more sensible about that and say, look, if it's injustice, if there are things going on that you don't like, you have to Speak out. Islam teaches us that, you know, and don't just say that because this person's my brother, my sister in Islam that I have to keep quiet. You know, that has to end. And I think within the community spaces, we also have to be less judgmental of each other. We have to allow for the diversity. We have to be encouraging of different viewpoints. We're really bad at that now, you know, and we have such an amazing, diverse history from the time of the Prophet till now. But it just, as I say, of diversity, of difference of opinion, of celebrating that. And yet now we seem to be closing down the spaces for debate. Everybody wants to sit somebody in a box and not allow them to be, you know, express themselves. And this whole idea of scholars and how you have to just listen to one person and you can't express. And for me, it's just really creating an unhealthy environment that I think is just not good for any of us. You know, and sometimes Muslims find it easier to deal with others who maybe aren't Muslim, but within our own sort of spaces, that really needs to move on. And those of us that feel that need to make that happen, I think.
1, 2.
1, 2. 1,
2.
1,
2.
What I want to ask you is, I mean, and you've been here, we've got women from all over the country, the UK, that have kind of come here. Why is it so important for women to do this type of work?
Well, I had a real struggle when I was doing the pre-conference questionnaire, because if I'm not careful, I end up sounding more critical of men than I want to sound. But we're actually very good at listening to each other and having the proper conversations that Marianne was calling listening for listening. And women, most women, are able to do that, even if they're very different or from different cultures or from different places. And having that honest conversation is always the beginning of changing things in our communities. All the charities I've ever worked with, relief charities across the world, find that if they start with the women, they change the communities. Whereas if they try to start with the men, it doesn't work as well. That's just how it is. It's very interesting.
One other question, I mean, we've seen an awful lot happen around the world, you know, and the obvious two major events that crop up when I've been involved in this type of work, you have the 7/7s, the land in England, you've got a recession now, there's all sorts of things happening. Do you think those events have brought communities and women in particular together, or have caused even more friction, and is this sort of thing helping?
The second bit first, yes, I do think everything that gathers us together to really share our experience helps. I think really, really matters. I think whether what's going on in our world helps or hinders depends on where you're coming from. The women who are dealing with poverty, dealing with difficulty, dealing with pain, dealing with health issues, thinking about this country and the NHS at the moment, those women are drawn closer together because they understand each other. Whereas it's always possible that if you're coming from a different place and you're not aware of those difficulties, then you're not drawn closer into that community. I think the most important challenge for most women is the stand up and be counted challenge, because we've got so many other things to do, most of us, that it's very easy to focus on the local and not be willing, either because there's pressure from other places or because we think, what's my voice going to be heard, or it's not going to be heard, or it's not going to make a difference, or and to actually do the standing up. And together, one of the things I mentioned in one of the groups was the huge privilege of the women of faith, and one or two of no faith at all actually, in Jerusalem, who stand every Friday in silence to say justice matters. They just gather and stand, and that takes a huge amount of courage, and that's what we need. We need to find, as we share together, the courage to support each other, to stand up and be counted.
What keeps you going? What kind of inner source keeps you doing all the amazing things that I know that you have done?
the challenge of God, the fact that I believe very profoundly that God says, I mean, it's there in the scriptures that actually the three faiths at least share. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. I still don't get that right, but that's the huge challenge, and God is with us in that, in whatever way we view God being with us. God is with us in that, and that keeps me going, the knowledge that this is what God requires, and that God will strengthen me, assist me, and that's why I need the community of faith around me, whether it's the Christian faith or the shared faith. The communities of faith say, actually, yes, if we can do this, we can, and that keeps me going, particularly on the bad days when I could dump the whole world and think, it's never going to happen. And then I meet another amazing woman with another amazing story, and I think, yes, we can. Yes, we can do this. And God is with us.
Thank you. Right, okay, we'll start with Jessica. What are some of the conversations and things that you've been having during the course of the past day or two?
Loads of really, really interesting conversations. We've talked about our localities, we've talked about the difference between the cities we come from, and we've talked about the similarities. We've talked about mental health issues that cross-cut faith, culture and gender. We've talked a lot about gender, we've talked what we can do in the future, and we've talked about what we're already doing. But really, we've just made friends.
You're all from Birmingham, so why is this type of work so important?
I think Birmingham is so diverse, culturally, racially. We all different shades of brown, different shades of white even, and nobody really understands each other. We're all just, as it was mentioned, we're all living parallel lives. And I think just an opportunity like this encourages people like us that attend to go out there and maybe ask questions and not to make judgments and things. So,
yes, I feel that so many pockets of people have got such experience and expertise, and because we're living parallel lives, we're not sharing them and engaging them in our community. So we have just found the most amazing group of people from Birmingham. Thank you. You've set our group up for us, which could have taken a couple of years to do. And each person has got their expertise and their network. And we've already set up our first meeting. We're energised to use each other's experience and to go forward hand in hand.
Yes. It was amazing because you start talking to different people and you find how ignorant you are sometimes. It's just, you find out about themselves. You actually forget about everything. You forget about religion, belief, anything. You're just two people talking about yourselves, which is what, yesterday the conversation for the soul was just fantastic by listening. And I remember Peter and me, I've just made this beautiful relationship connection. And as we were leaving, she just said, I love you people. I can't wait to meet you again. I mean, she's in London, we're in Birmingham, but this is what this conference has given us.
Even if it only just happened to us, it's been worth it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we've asked a lot of questions.
We haven't got all the answers.
Oh, I don't think we're supposed to have all the answers.
Right. So what are we going to do now?
Let's put the kettle on.